All right. Yes. All right, everybody, we're going to start. So this is the second economic justice session that we're running. Some of you may have been to the one earlier. This one is, we're going to be focusing on some of the solutions to some of the problems that you might have heard in other sessions that you've been already, this morning included. So my name's Ahmed. I'm the trade campaigner at War on Want. And we've convened a panel here today to talk about not just the big structural problems that we know we all face, but obviously some of the solutions. So we want you to come out of this session feeling sort of a little bit empowered and a bit excited about the possibility of change. So I'm just going to quickly introduce some of the panelists. So to my left here, we've got John McDonnell, MP. John was elected for Hayes and Harlington in 1997. He campaigns for investment in local public services and the economy, and served as shadow chancellor from 2015 to 2020. Then we have Bhumika Muchhala. She's a senior policy advisor at the Third World Network. She has 20 years of experience in analysis, campaigning, and education on global economic governance. To her left, we have Charles Stevenson. He's a scholar activist at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, researching the macroeconomics of a degrowth transition. Then we have Gyekye Tanoh, who's a social justice activist and development economist based in Accra, Ghana. He is one of the conveners of the Justice and Freedom for Palestine Network in Ghana. And then joining us online later, we have Jayati Ghosh, who's a professor of economics, focusing on progressive economics, addressing issues such as the global food system, workers' rights, and austerity. So I'm just going to quickly say, for those of you who weren't in the first session, which is where we heard about some of the colonial roots of these crises, these multiple crises that we're living under at the moment. Poverty, global inequality, the climate crisis, these are all problems and crises forged 500 years of slavery, domination, and conquest. This is the history that forced roles onto the global south, the roles that the global south continue to play today. The wealth we see all around us here in London is built on the backs of colonized peoples, our raw materials, our labor, and crucially not just our labor in the global south, but migrant workers here in the UK as well, in the global north. And today we see in the post-independence era how this inequality and poverty is enshrined through currency hierarchies, unequal trade relationships, exploitative debt relationships, systemic corporate tax avoidance, the architecture of the international financial system. And it's a system of discipline where roles are forced onto the global south, and any time a country tries to break out of those roles, they're disciplined by the financial systems and through political force. I guess the message that I have to say is that these structures are not permanent, that it's important to be realistic and face them head on. But ultimately, they're changeable. They're deep-rooted, but they need to change. And the global economy is a key arena of this struggle. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Bhumika, who's prepared some talks, some remarks. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. This is an incredible convening. So I've been asked to speak about financing for a just transition and sort of the systemic impediments we are up against, the structures that we are in. So I would start by saying that, financing for a just transition involves two central dynamics among many others, but I'll just center in on these two: ecological and climate debt as one area, in conjunction with the south to north financial drain, otherwise also known as unequal global economic exchange, both of which operate through past colonial to present imperial time and space. What is ecological debt? It's the extraction of resources, incalculable environmental impacts from colonial era to current day carbon colonialism that is commodifying and financializing land across the South through dispossessing indigenous marginalized communities of their rights, land, and livelihood. So it's still very much at play today. It's not just a historical conjecture. Climate debt points to how developed countries, in particular the United States, as the economic hegemon, are responsible for 3/4 of historical emissions, as well as excessive global consumption, constituting less than 20% of the world's population. The North has absorbed, former colonizer countries, or the global North, has absorbed the vast majority of carbon emissions and consumptions. Therefore, climate reparations is not charity or aid, but a moral obligation to repay historical and current debt. The massive transfer of wealth from South to North is not just part of a long legacy of financial extraction through colonial plunder and mass enslavement that has deprived the South of capital and resources, distorting economies away from diversified production and self-sufficiency to a chain of dependency that is structurally embedded in various production systems. But we also need to look at the examples of the current moment in imperial tax and debt architecture. Corporate tax avoidance and trade misinvoicing has led to approximately 7.8 trillion siphoned out of the developing world into tax havens in the decade between 2004 to 2013. This is just a decade. And where it comes to interest payments to creditors from the chronic debt condition of the global South, the chronic debt problem, we are talking about over 4 trillion or about 4.2 trillion in interest payments since 1980. This is just to share some basic examples of the colossal financial transfers that intensify inequality, deepen material deprivation, and lead to a loss of the public financial resources, but also the economic articulation, the economic resilience that could otherwise be spent on financing not just basic needs, but the right to development, the needs of a just transition, fulfilling the economic and social rights of people. So let me focus now on the key nexus between climate reparations and this financial drain, which is the vicious cycle between debt and climate. We know today the global South is in a historic debt crisis. 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress. Foreign debt payments from the South have increased by 120% between 2010 and 2021. So this is in large part due to the pandemic's urgent financing needs, but also we see an aggressive intensification of the leverage of debt as a central tool of colonial to imperial extraction. Within these payments, almost half of payments from the global South are to private lenders, making it much harder to restructure or cancel given the intransigence of private creditors, the vast majority in the financial markets in City of London and New York City's Wall Street. Debt payments amount to approximately 25% of total government spending across all developing countries. It is double that of education, 9.5 times that of health, 13.5 times that of social protection. And for the small group of countries that are reporting annual climate spending, it is 32 times greater than climate spending. 32. According to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, two neocolonial institutions that have orchestrated the very construction of the indebted state across the South, the poorest countries today spend more of their public budget on repaying debt than at any point in the past 3 decades. These debts are not simply bad in the abstract. They have a real human cost. Every dollar spent servicing debt is a dollar not spent on public health, clean energy, improved sanitation, or any of the myriad public services and energy and industrial transition needs required for the just transition. These costs, we need to remember, are heaped on top. They are layered. Following 500 years of plunder, genocide, and ongoing resource extraction, now compounded by the crises, the emergency of climate change, where 1.5 degree threshold from the IPCC has long been, has already been crossed in the last several months. So these are the costs for which the South is owed climate and economic reparations in an intertwined, inseparable manner. We cannot anymore separate climate justice from economic justice. The climate crisis, in a nutshell, is not possible to address without debt and economic justice. The material and the way in which this vicious cycle works, I want to flesh out in just one way. The material and monetary losses caused by climate catastrophes trigger debt crises, in large part because 70%, according to UNCTAD, according to the UN, 70% of climate financing is in the form of debt-creating loans, with little fiscal space left after the debt payments they're regularly making, as I just outlined, approximately 25% of the public budget. Countries have little option but to accept further debt-creating loans by creditors and institutions. Lending to deal with climate disasters is like pouring gasoline on fire. Meanwhile, the Civil Society Review, endorsed by 166 civil society networks worldwide, estimates annual financial loss and damage from 2030 onwards at approximately 400 billion per year for the South, with total financial losses reaching 700 billion. So why do these climate vulnerabilities make it costlier to borrow? Well, in large part because the three monopoly credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch, have since 2014 integrated climate risk susceptibility as a form of debt risk in their sovereign ratings. Higher borrowing costs means even greater debt, in a true vicious cycle, resulting in the weaker ability to respond to the climate emergency. This means the South will have decreasing domestic resources available to invest in financing a just transition due to the debt crisis, with even less resources to deal with emergency climate. So within this cycle, racial capitalism and intersectional inequalities, in particular gendered inequalities, mean that women and the racialized minorities get hit the hardest. And in this way, we really see how women in the global South, who are more dependent on natural resources for their livelihood, are on the front lines of the climate threat. In the so-called least developed countries, 79% of women report agriculture as their primary source of livelihood, relative to 48% worldwide. So ways forward, I'm just going to outline a few ways forward, most of which have been talked about before, so I won't go in. A key way forward, of course, is all the calls for debt justice that the global debt justice movements have been making. What are some of these calls? Well, first and foremost, a binding and credible debt workout mechanism within a multilateral framework. This has been a long-standing call, not just by economic justice networks. 134 developing countries within the UN General Assembly have passed resolutions in 2013, 14, and 15. So consistent emphasis on a debt restructuring mechanism and to address also unsustainable and illegitimate debt. And this is referring to the debt accrued by corrupt rulers, and we see this all over the world today. But in light of how, when it comes to the debt restructuring solutions, we keep coming back to a more systemic question. And that leads us right back to the larger international financial architecture. And again, how the financial architecture is continually creating the indebted state through the nexus of dollar hegemony, free capital flows, which means the taboo against regulating financial flows, as well as the market discipline that is exerted by financial markets. By market discipline, we're talking about the withholding of access to credit, and we're talking about the compliance or the subordination of many South governments to, not just repaying debt, but to maintaining low inflation levels, low fiscal deficit levels, and a 60% normative rule on the debt to GDP ratio. And these are rules, this is a fiscal rule book that is arbitrarily created by the European Monetary Union's Maastricht Treaty, which is then universally applied in great measure due to the International Monetary Fund internalizing the rules that are coming from the North. This is a clear example of economic imperialism and how Eurocentric models get imposed globally in very arbitrary ways without any economic justification. There is no actual theory to back up most of the rule book. Ways forward involve this sort of a fiscal justice approach and campaign that is very much in synchrony with delinking in the tradition of the political decolonization movements of the new international economic order. This sort of delinking involves really challenging the metrics and assumptions of neoclassical monetarist models, challenging GDP as the singular metric, challenging debt limits and debt sustainability reliability in their calculations, and also questioning these internalized, invisibilized assumptions that govern our global economy. I'll give you 3 examples. Crowding out the fact that public spending and public investment crowds out private spending. There's no truth to this pudding. There is no proof. There's no proof to this one. Time and time again, we see quite the opposite. Public investments actually bring in private investments. There is no simplistic binary here. Another assumption is one called the net savings generation, in that net savings is important to show market confidence. And of course, we have the internalization of sound macro policies, such as that I described, of low fiscal deficit levels and controlling inflation to an absurdly low level of 2%, in much part through the central bank independence mantra. Tax is a huge one for mass-scale redistribution and equity. We're talking financial transactions tax for global wealth redistribution, as well as progressive taxation on wealth and income, including income from capital, profits, financial assets, inheritance, property, and land. At the center of this is the ongoing negotiations happening right now in the UN General Assembly for a universal intergovernmental UN tax body that includes all countries in an equal way, that addresses the tax abuse by multinational corporations. This is the 7.8 trillion I mentioned that was siphoned in the decade from 2004 to 13. So I conclude with also making a call for this imperative to decolonize the hegemonic singularity of neoclassical economics. There are so many other plural, diverse schools of economic thinking. At least 9 other major schools can be considered to decolonize economics, including feminist, heterodox, ecological, Marxist, Keynesian, structuralist, where neoclassical economic theory says that societies are made up of rational and selfish individuals, risk is calculable, choice, exchange, and consumption are most important, and the free market would automatically correct inefficiencies. Structural, feminist, ecological economics says societies are composed of gender unequal class structures. The world is complex and uncertain. The most important domain of economies is care and human welfare. The beating heart is the financing and the resilience of public systems and public services, and the state must use proactive fiscal policy to redistribute wealth, diversify economies, create decent work opportunities, and protect local and small businesses. So with this, I conclude that the imperative for financing a just transition is really about a structural and systemic delinking for people's sovereignty, and we can hark back to the formation of the new international economic order in the political decolonization era. They imagined new institutions. They configured different relationships between countries, and they had a coherent politics of reparations rooted in the concept of sovereign equality, in that equality among sovereigns is about correcting the historical colonial drain and unequal exchange. And so sovereign equality means the reflected today in the climate principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the way in which they practiced an anti-colonial tradition of world making, the just transition is essentially and ultimately a struggle of anti-imperialism, which necessitates the advancement of an internationalist reparations and delinking agenda in this tradition of world making. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhumika. It's worth noting as well, today, I think this year is the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order. And so that's a vision from the past. I'm going to pass over to Charles, who's going to tell us a little bit about degrowth.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Stevenson, and I research the macroeconomics of degrowth. And I was also really excited to come listen to this panel until Jason Hickel missed his train, and I had to start frantically coming up with something to say. So Jason sends, and I quote, his sincerest apologies and revolutionary fervor to the audience, and I'm going to try to bring that into what I'm about to say. So degrowth is part of this plural economics that Bhumika was just outlining. And for those of you who haven't encountered it before, degrowth centers on the idea that in order to achieve a sustainable future, we need a socially just reduction of energy and resource use in rich countries. Degrowth is about building an economy in which the needs of all of us are achieved within planetary boundaries. And you might think that that's a beautiful idea with a terrible name. And I think that's all right. What matters here is the content. And the label is a matter of political strategy and should be context specific. How do we convince a majority of working people who've been battered by decades of austerity to support a movement whose tagline is less is more? And perhaps we talk about it as a world of radical abundance, a world in which we overcome social deprivation while tackling the greatest ecological crises of our time. We talk about a society of public luxury and private sufficiency in which we all have more of what's needed. More time with our friends and loved ones, more opportunities to explore our creativity, the freedom to live free of ecological collapse, of exploitation, alienation, and artificial scarcity. So we can call that degrowth, we can call it ecosocialism, it doesn't really matter to me. The essential is that we tackle our social and ecological crises simultaneously. As we know, we will end the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis at the same time or not at all. And this is what Jason calls the double objective of ecosocialism. And it was also the logic behind the Green New Deal, or what John called the Green Industrial Revolution. And that logic is crucial, but these early formulations of the Green New Deal didn't incorporate the imperial structure of the global economy that Bhumika was just laying out for us. They didn't account for ecologically unequal exchange, as you said. Every year, the countries of the global north, and it's important to stress, this is the minority world. This is Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, appropriate energy, labor, and resources to the tune of $10 trillion in northern prices. And this needs to end. So degrowth conserves this double objective of ecosocialism while also calling for an end to unequal exchange, an end to the power of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to dictate policy and enforce austerity in the ways you just outlined. It calls for an end to the neocolonial debt cycles, which you were also describing. We talked about in the first session. Crucially, degrowth is not about Europeans dictating policy to the global south, but about building movements here that can back up demands coming from the global south for food sovereignty, for reparations, for national liberation. So what does that actually look like? What do we talk about when we talk about degrowth? Well, the research we're doing in Barcelona right now centers on a policy package that focuses on a job guarantee, universal public services, and a care income. Now, a job guarantee is a policy that I don't hear talked about often enough, but I can see Fidel Kaboub here in the room, and he's done essential work on this. And the basic idea is that the federal government act as an employer for anyone seeking work. So this is a way of abolishing involuntary unemployment by providing paid work for 30 hours a week at a wage for anyone seeking it. And crucially, these jobs would be locally administered, so communities make their own decisions about what work they deem most necessary. Importantly, it sets an immediate benchmark with which the private sector needs to compete. So really, a job guarantee is also a huge transfer of power from capital towards workers. Universal public services are decommodified systems that ensure access to the basic services that we need to live a full life: education, healthcare, transport, energy, water, communication. In many cases, we already know what this looks like. Think about what the NHS in Britain would be able to do if it were properly funded. In some cases, like food and housing, the research is still ongoing. But crucially, the job guarantee would also act as a driver to build out these systems. These are also the jobs of retrofitting buildings and care work that were part of the initial formulations of kind of a green industrial revolution. And finally, a care income is close to what many of you may know as a universal basic income, but this is specifically aimed at ending the undervaluation of care work, which is done within households. So, as we know, most of this work is done by women, primarily racialized women. So this is just to give you a bit of a flavor of what degrowth looks like in policy terms. And I was also asked to speak to some of the false solutions that are being put forward to our interlocking social and ecological crises. But I don't think I really need to convince you of that. I don't think that any of you who are devoting your time this weekend need to be convinced that the Inflation Reduction Act in the US or the Green Deal here in Europe are going to solve the climate crisis. I don't think that any of you think that Keir Starmer is going to lead us towards a sustainable future. The dominant framework in neoliberal policy circles today is what the economist Daniela Cabor calls the de-risking state. And it basically involves enlisting private capital to achieve investment objectives in so-called green technologies. And time again, I come to these panels and I'm told, oh, the falling price of renewable energy should be a source of optimism because soon it will outcompete fossil fuels. And this, I don't know if any of you engaged with the recent book out by Hannah Ritchie. I think it's called Not the End of the World. And this is kind of the central premise. But sadly, our economies are structured around profitability, not price. Investment is determined by profitability, right? So this idea that fossil fuels are just going to be outcompeted in a world in which fossil fuels remain profitable is just fantasy. There's an important new book coming out by Brett Christophers called The Price is Wrong, which goes into this argument. And I encourage you all to look it up. But frankly, the economics that underlie green growth and techno-optimism are embarrassing. Finally, I wanted to go back for a second to my policy proposals because anyone who puts forward these very bold plans, and John will know this much better than most, will be asked, how are you going to pay for it? And as I remember, the labor manifestos in 2017 and 2019 were fully costed. And that meant that for each policy, we knew where the money that was going to pay for it was going to come from, right? We knew which taxes were going to pay for which policy. And this is the way we're conventionally taught to think about public spending. But we also know that that's inaccurate. Public spending doesn't actually work like that. The Treasury doesn't wait for tax revenue in order to spend money into the economy. It's the exact reverse. The Treasury spends pounds every time that it pays a nurse or enlists a company to build a bridge or anything else, and that increases the money supply, and then the money supply is reduced through taxation. So this means that taxation has a crucial role to play, and it's sometimes underemphasized, but taxation is essential to reduce the grotesque power that the rentier class holds over production. It's essential to discourage socially and ecologically damaging behaviors. It's an essential way of anticipating inflationary pressure points within the real economy. These are the limits that we need to be thinking about, the productive capacity of our actual economies. So when we design this just transition that we're talking about, think about its financings, these are the questions that we need to be asked. Do we actually have enough nurses to provide the care here in Britain? Do we have the resources that we need for that? So these are the questions, as you raised in your introduction, the questions on a global scale of currency hierarchies. They are crucially, as you laid out, the questions of the debt crisis that the global south finds itself in. They're questions of labor and access to resources. But how are we going to pay for it is slightly the wrong thing to ask. And to end, I'll just say that I wanted to make this relevant to building power in the 21st century. Why are these policies interesting for us here today? And it's important to stress that the idea is not that we're going to deliver these policies to some benevolent policymaker and they're just going to be implemented. We know that that's not going to happen. Instead, we should see these policies as fulfilling that double objective of eco-socialism, as tackling the social and the ecological together, and as acting as a rallying cry for the mass movement of working people that we need to make them a reality. So my contention is that we can't have eco-socialism without degrowth in rich countries, and we can't have degrowth without a mass movement of working people set on contesting state power. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much for that, and also for stepping in last minute, literally last minute. So next up is Gyekye, and we're going to hear a bit about what this looks like from a Pan-Africanist perspective.
Hi, I'm very short, so if I sit, you mightn't see me. And just like Napoleon, short people crave attention. So, no. Well, I've been asked to talk about trade and its centrality. I think that everyone in Britain needs no convincing about that centrality, given the way in which Brexit has been one of the lightning rods of politics and so on. In fact, if the Brexit debate had gone differently, if the left had different alternatives, our comrade John might have been sitting in 11 Downing Street or whatever it is that the Chancellor, wherever it is that the Chancellor lays his head these days. The question of trade, of course, has been central to the way in which, under neoliberalism, the kinds of international economic relations have been restructured. And they have been restructured in a manner that has accentuated the polarization between rich and poor in every part of the world, but also rich and poor between the global north and the global south, and in particular, rich and poor between owners of capital, the employer class, our rulers, and the rest of us. And I think a continent like Africa dramatically underlines some of what has taken place. If you look at the case of Africa, we know that trade liberalization has been the direct cause of the premature end of efforts to industrialize economies away from primary raw material commodity export dependence. We know that the industrialization has been devastating. In 1980, for example, total employment in sub-Saharan Africa, 28% of people were in manufacturing and so on. I'm fully aware of the consequences of an environmentally unfriendly industrialization, but let's take some things for granted so I can make a couple of important points. And that has collapsed to the level of about 4% today. Of course, it's uneven. A country like South Africa will account for most of that average. A country like Niger won't be registering on that scale at all, in all probability, apart from the uranium mines, which the French multinationals and the Americans want to get their hands into as we speak. Industrialization, of course, isn't simply about industry. It speaks to the question of production writ large. And that is why the collapse of industrialization, which also represents the collapse of the ability of one part of economies to supply needs of those in the rural economy, those in agriculture, and so on and so forth, that interaction, the collapse of that interaction has also meant the devastation of agriculture in much of Africa itself. So you have deindustrialization, you have de-agrarianization. These are the realities that we confront today. And what that has wrought is a vast pool of immiseration. Unprecedented, I suppose, in modern times. Yes, the World Bank says that the minimum living wage, ridiculous as it is supposed to be what, $1.90, or has it increased generously to about $2 something? Well, in the case of Africa, a majority, the mean earnings, the daily mean earnings of people in the vast pool of the precarious labor is around 62 pence a day. And the new middle class that the World Bank was celebrating in Africa, its mean earnings would be on the order of about 15 pounds a day. Now, you are here fighting for 15 pounds an hour, which is probably too small anyway, but here we are talking about this. Now, it's important to situate this kind of understanding in what are the mechanisms that enable this to happen. All of us know that the institutions such as the WTO, that the European Union, that the North American Free Trade Agreement, and so on and so forth, those which are being conducted in Asia and the Pacific and so on, are directly the mechanism by which capital enables these processes to be initiated, to be locked in, and to recompose the balance of who gets what, who gets the job, how much you get paid, and so on and so forth. And that is why today, as we speak, many of those who are fighting for alternatives are very much concerned with what we do, for example, when the WTO, the 13th Ministerial of the WTO meets very soon. Debates are going on, critical confrontations going on about how digitalization, for example, mightn't become a new form of global division where these inequalities that I'm talking about become weaponized and accentuated. And of course, at the peril of a sustainable, global, green, and just, equitable, just transition. We also know that many countries in the past have found different ways, have attempted different ways to address this question of trade. So we found that, for example, in the new international economic order that Bhumika and comrade, sorry, what's your name again? Charles, sorry. It was Jason on the thing, so, I thought it was Jason Charles or something. Anyway, we found that governments across the global south began to take measures to ensure that the imbalances in trade they were able to redress them directly and frontally. But those efforts didn't succeed, and those efforts are part of the preamble to where we are today. All of us who are fighting along the front of free trade, our efforts, I think, are absolutely required, but I don't think that they're adequate. So when we speak about alternatives, John is not in number 11. Neither is any of us. What are the alternatives that you and I can begin to enact? And that's what I'd like to use my last 5 minutes also to address. The thing about trade, of course, is that it isn't simply about one mechanism. It is the way in which it enables the production system itself to be restructured. So we find, for example, that when we talk about climate finance, or we talk about what the alternatives may be, at the same time that we're lamenting the dearth, the shortage, the outrageous fact that there's no climate finance, whilst there's $250 billion to fight wars in Ukraine and God knows what else for people to decimate and wipe out the entire Palestinian population, we also know that as we speak, there is money sloshing around for other purposes as well. Just this week, Rio Tinto, a British mining company, has approved what it calls the biggest mining investment ever in world history. This is taking place in West Africa, in a country called Guinea. The initial projections are that the investments will be to the order of 20 billion. And of course, Rio Tinto is one of those companies whose annual turnover is bigger than the country that it's operating to start with. Last year, Rio Tinto distributed to its shareholders over 16 billion, almost 17 billion pounds. One of the record levels of shareholder payouts ever. Now, Rio Tinto is a British company. Okay? The capacity of you sitting in this room to confront it, to ensure even with the small measures that start from saying that those shareholders who stole that 17 billion from the poor of the world ought to pay capital gains tax, they ought to be dispossessed one way or the other, incrementally and so on, that's a start. But of course, there are other things that can link to. Because Rio Tinto is also dependent not simply on government tax breaks and rigged financial rules and rigged trade rules, it is also dependent on the labor of people, including in the global south itself. So here you are in a situation where, when the Financial Times reported this, there was a small one-line bit in the article where the CEO of Rio Tinto says, of course, everything we do will be community-friendly. It will depend on the approval of communities. We will ensure, adequate and fair labor, conditions and so on and so forth. We know, of course, the man is a thief, he's a liar, he's a murderer. But nonetheless, why does he have to say it? He has to say it because the working people of Guinea will now have the power to scupper what Rio Tinto is about. The Rio Tinto project isn't simply about mining, it's about the type of infrastructure from rail to port that we saw in the colonial period. That means the communities that are affected, those who work on the rails, those who work on the mines, those who work on the point, or at the ports, all can have a conjoint interest, just like you sitting here in London can also impinge upon Rio Tinto. So when we talk about alternatives, concretely, one of the things that ought to concern us, whether we're starting off from the angle, the all-important angle of the needs and requirements of the Global South, is that production capabilities, the ability to produce goods and services on which terms, for which use, in whose benefit, ordinary working people must come into control of that. That's the first condition. Wherever they are in the world, production takes place, profits take place, and therefore those possibilities exist. The second point, of course, is that when we talk about those production chains and the trade and financial mechanisms that accompany them, they are not linked to any one country, any one locality, any one community. If a community wants a green transformation, if a community in the Sahel, where Guinea is very close to, in fact, parts of Guinea are in the Sahel, wants to ensure that it has new water management systems, it can't possibly regulate that on its own, as simply as a community. Okay, because these flow from rivers, they flow from the sea, you all know the systems that are involved, so it requires it to make coordinated efforts, democratically speaking, with other communities from different ethnicities, different religions, and so on. Nor can we leave those communities intact as they are if they are patriarchal and so on. The rights of women and so on have to take to the fore. Nor can we fail to address the question of ethnicity. So when you are here fighting the question of green transition, and as Bhumika eloquently said, the question of confronting race is central to it. The question of ensuring that identity politics of all kinds do not divide our ranks is central to it. And that centrality, apart from its moral and ethical power, also is one that is rooted in objective conditions of production and trade, as I'm trying to indicate here. So, comrades, let me end. I know time is short. I hope you will get a word in at some point. But let me end by saying this. Ultimately, yes, we have been brutalized, victimized, immiserated. Not everybody. You might look at my tummy and say, who are you talking about? But you know what I mean. But the fact is that we can fight back. And our capacity to fight back, our ultimate orientation on that capacity, and that capacity informing the strategies that we take at every level, every space, and so on, these are the central questions. And I think this point in time, in a system as rapacious as this is, as a system which knows absolutely no limits, the opportunities and the necessity of challenging are manifold, countless, and so on. How we do so, I think, is something that all of us have an opportunity to do, and I hope that when we leave this room, we are armed to do that better, and we are armed to start that tonight, continue tomorrow, until we win the world that all of us deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Next up, we have John McDonnell. I don't know if you want to stand up or? Okay.
I'll come here not because of any Napoleonic complex, but because I'm not very good at juggling with microphones and papers and all the rest. What reminded me in the last speech is that we don't thank people enough for what they do. And the RTZ campaign and the Vedanta campaign was largely led in this country by the London Mining Group. And I just want to put on record the work that they do, and they have done for the last 2 decades. And I'd just like to thank them for what they do in bringing us together on those individual campaigns and direct action campaigns. Anyway, I've done notes to speak to, because if you're on the left of the Labour Party at the moment, anything you say or do might be taken down and used in evidence against you. So I thought I'd be very precise. And I'm going to that's the first disciplinary charge. Anyway, I'm going to make 10, I want to address that bit in the brief which says explore how progressive justice movements' demands for change to our economic and financial systems can be realized. I want to make 10 points around that, and they're 10 points that possibly others might describe as 10 points of the bleeding obvious, okay? But let me just go through it. The first point is this. Is actually, first of all, to thank the organizers of this event, because I think it could turn out to be, I think, one of the most significant comings together to talk about these issues that we've had in a number of years. And it could be what they call in business a point of inflection, where we look at our new roles and launch something more significant that could bring about quite transformative change. And the point I want to make is that there's a responsibility that falls upon those who operate within this country in particular. We're in the belly of the capitalist imperialist beast, if you like. In fact, only a mile and a half down the road is its center, the actual center of that imperial struggle that's gone on for so many centuries in the City of London. So I think this is a significant event, and the level of expertise from the sessions I've been in so far is just extraordinary in terms of the contributions people have made. So I just want to make that as a single point and thank War on Want for doing it. The second point I want to make is this, is that sometimes at the moment in particular, the scale of the problems we face, the things we're discussing today, global climate catastrophe potentially, the immense inequalities of wealth and power within our society, and also the scale and the complexity of the nature of the institutions that we're taking on, their huge power, their global reach, the financial institutions in particular. Both those scales of both the problems and the scale of the power of those bodies we're confronting, it's leading at times to a sort of political nihilism, almost a feeling, particularly in this political period, in this recent couple of years, is almost an atmosphere of defeated and defeatism if we're not extremely careful. And I think that's the second point I wanted. That's what we've got to confront at the moment. And particularly in this country, post the 2019 general election that we lost in terms of the left of the Labour Party, and also what's happened to them since then. The third point really I want to make is that it is particularly true when we come to the finance sector that it is complex, and we're up against possibly the most powerful institutions within our political system and our society. And we've talked about some of those. It isn't just the banks, it's the central banks in particular. It's the shadow banking that we never really have a thorough discussion about. And it is about the global and financial institutions, the rules by which they play, the IMF, the World Bank, and the other trade bodies. And it is about, as has been said, about the trade treaties. And we've heard in other sessions as well the work that we've been doing on the investor dispute arrangements that are taking place. So the third point I want to make is that complexity is there, but if you see the expertise that there is today, we can map out the institutions that we want to deal with, and for each of those institutions, we've generated a whole range of ideas and fairly straightforward policies that could transform them or abolish them and replace them. The fourth point I want to make is to overcome that sense of, in many campaigns and discussions that the issues are all too big or it's too difficult. The purpose of this conference and session like this is to therefore discuss strategy, and that's about understanding as much as we can about the society, the economy, the institutions that exist and that we're up against. Secondly, the changes that we need and want, and then third, about the way change can be brought about and the resources we have to apply. So I want to apply that in my fifth point to finance, really. Do we really have a common understanding of its history and its current operations, its effect? I think we do, but it's limited at the moment. And we're finding out today more and more, thank God, about the discussions about the financial crisis that we're facing. And in 2008, when the banking crash occurred, for a very limited period, there was a common knowledge about a number of those financial institutions. It didn't last long, but people realized actually that we were living with financial institutions that were effectively operating like a casino to the benefit of a fairly rich oligarchic elite and to the exploitation of all working people, both in the North and in the global South. The Jubilee campaign, to a certain extent in the year 2000, did a bit of that. But I think it was the banking crash that really shook people up and educated them how the system worked. But this is a mixed metaphor. The water closed very quickly over that. And we've had over a decade now in which mystification has taken place again. And as a result of that, I think less and less people fully understand how the system operates. So the sixth point I made, yeah, it is about capitalist hegemony. And we always seem to come back to Gramsci in these discussions, but there you are. And I think, therefore, it's about demonstrating exactly in the discussion today without complexity, just how much the financial institutions of this country in particular facilitate and are the conduit, not really of investment and trade in the traditional way people envisage them, and though this is a fair point of barter or something like this, but actually are ones that are based upon a history of established and sustained military conquest, colonial suppression, slavery, and yes, let's repeat time and time again, imperialism. And that imperialism that led to mass slaughter. And I think the financial institutions of the City of London have sort of sanitized themselves away from the implications upon, not just upon which they were built, but the crimes that were committed right the way across the globe. I have meeting after meeting with financiers when I was the Shadow Chancellor, and what was always interesting, we would always get one of our team to say, yes, thank you very much for all that you're doing in terms of investment, etc. But actually your wealth is based on slavery and mass slaughter across the globe. It sort of changed the conversation that we had with the finance sector. And the interesting thing as well is that we need to bring ourselves up to speed on that, about how, from the crude imperialism that brought about that mass slaughter, how it evolved into neo-colonial exploitation. And now what we've got is a state-engendered neoliberal financialization that's taken place across our society, our economy. There's an excellent book by a comrade of ours, Kostas Lapavitsas, and the writing collective that he's part of, The State of Capitalism, Economy, Society and Hegemony. It's really worth reading because I think it depicts very well that history, particularly of the finance sector in this country and what it did. And it also then goes on to explain that effectively now there's one imperial power left that dominates at the moment, and that's the US, although it's obviously facing the challenges from the global periphery, as they describe it, and the role of China. So therefore, I think we need to develop, first of all, as much as we possibly can, a narrative strategy for understanding what we're up against, but also for mobilizing. And that narrative strategy is about explaining the history of finance capital in this country, the role it's played, the impact of that's had in terms of imperialism and the development of it, and how it's now moved on to new structures. So my seventh point is just understanding those current structures and methods of operation. The area I mentioned before, where I don't think we're having sufficient discussion of, is around shadow banking, but also now the interconnections of our financial institutions with data and media global institutions and elites. And in particular, the development related to that of artificial intelligence. I'm of that generation who, in the 1980s, we saw the introduction of the Big Bang, as some remember it. And it was then the first time, really, when financial institutions updated themselves, where decision-making on massive sums of trade and shipment of wealth could be done, first of all, on a computerized system. And it meant, therefore, that the traditional elements of control that some people thought were there were completely overridden virtually overnight. And that's what we're witnessing at the moment, particularly in relation to the exploitation of data and the calculations, decisions that will be taken and then implemented as a result of this new coalition between the financial institutions, the traditional ones, and therefore artificial intelligence and data holders. I just want to go on to the eighth point I'll make, which is a simplistic one, really. If we are talking about, first of all, we have to understand the world that we're dealing with, the financial institutions that we have to deal with, the history of them as well. I do think we have to have a clear view on what we want. I think the change that we want is fairly straightforward. We want to develop an economy that's based upon not the pursuit of profit, but the satisfaction of need. And I think we just need to be very clear about that. What we're about is making sure that we can satisfy the needs that people have. We have a relatively short lifetime, and so therefore to satisfy the needs within that short lifetime is critical, in which people can have an enhanced quality of life. But we need to do that, and this is, I suppose, the discussion that we've had for the last 20 years for the first time in our history, is it has to be within the constraints of natural resources, so that we want to protect and restore nature, the earth itself. And I think we need to be very explicit every time we speak to people about what our objectives are then. So my ninth point is this: how do you go about it? I don't think there's anything certain about what would work, and we need to be clear about that. And some attempts in the past, to be frank, about how we seek to create an economy which is based upon need and on profits have been disasters. The planned economies that were developed. But at the same time, what we've got, we can't settle for capitalism as the least worst option, because we're running out of time. And the implications of capitalism at the moment is that, exactly as others have said on platform after platform today, the resources of the earth will not be there to enable capitalism to operate in any form within the next 30 years. So therefore, I think it is almost back to the drawing board on the methodology of change that we want. And I think we should be clear about the principles of that. First of all, I think the principles of democratic control are always the ones that are more likely to offer a better way forward than the control of effectively the rule by an elite of oligarchs in the finance sector. The second element of that, I think the principle that we should be advocating, is actually, alongside democratic control, is public ownership. And that it provides the basis of democratic control, but also ease of implementation and decision making. And in some instances, public ownership has worked, and some instances failed. So we need to ensure we look at the optimum level and operation of public ownership. And the third element is democracy, public ownership, and then I suppose the weakest element is regulation. So it is the weakest form of control, but nevertheless, it's a methodology that we need to draw upon in some instances. In terms of the regulation experience in this country, because of the political interference in the forms of regulation, we've seen how much it's failed. Particularly, the best example is the water company's privatization. 30 years of regulation have polluted our rivers and our seas. But in other aspects as well, regulation has been about as effective too. So those three elements are principles I think we have to work on: democracy, public ownership, effective regulation. So if you then take that, and this is my ninth point really, if you start applying that in our discussions here about our finance sector, let's just go through some of the things we should now be talking about in terms of our campaigning in the belly of the beast. First of all, in terms of democratic control, we need now a fuller discussion about the democratic control of central banks in particular. We've always argued about after Gordon Brown introduced the independence of the Bank of England, and it became a fetish. But even acknowledging an independent role for the central bank, the mandate of that bank is under democratic control still. So our debate in this country should be, what is the mandate for the UK central bank? Why isn't it about sustainability? Why isn't it about tackling inequalities of the global south? Why isn't it about redistribution of power? And we should examine every other public agency on that basis. The second element, in terms of if we're going to apply public ownership as a principle to the finance sector in this country, it is about at least establishing some form of national bank under public ownership. Our proposals in the Labour manifesto, in the last two manifestos, was about a national investment bank, at least, to build upon, and linked to that a people's bank. We called it the post bank because we were operating from post offices. But that would be a challenge within the financial sector and set standards of operation that could have implications both in terms of how the banking system operates financially, in terms of protecting the environment, but also in terms of acting globally as well. And then the third element, and if we're going to apply regulation to the finance sector here, it is about enforcing openness and transparency, a duty of candor amongst directors and others, supervisory boards introduced, a regulatory code and conditions of any company or any element within the finance sector operating within this country. We were proposing then a series of conditions by which anyone could operate either through forming a company or being listed on the London stock market. And that would be basics like the protection of human rights, protection of trade union and workers' rights, environmental standards, and as I say, the duty of candor. And one of the areas that we particularly want to apply it to was possibly the most scandalous sector of failure in the finance sector in this country is the audit sector itself and the big audit companies, where it's scandal after a scandal where they've allowed rip-offs to take place. If you look at some of the work by Prem Sikka, it's important that, again, some of that needs to be debated and discussed in more detail. My 10th and final point, because you're beginning to nod off, who is it who's going to bring this about? Who is it going to bring this about? Well, we looked 5 years ago, Jayati, who we're going to listen to, who I think is absolutely one of the most brilliant intellectual activists I've come across. Jayati and I were talking about 5 years ago when we were convened a social forum. And at that stage, we were looking for the electoral process to enable us to start with an election of a Labour government that would introduce a whole range of these policies, a government committed to this process, but we were failed to be elected. And the lesson of that failure was actually you can't rely upon governments. No change has ever been brought about in this country, or most probably anywhere, by individual governments that haven't been supported by social movements. So change always comes from social movements. It's never brought about by governments without social movements. And as soon as we start appreciating that, therefore the responsibility falls on all our shoulders now, particularly because of the historic role of this country, particularly because of the local location of financial institutions in this country and in this capital city in the movement, in this capital city in particular, is about how do we therefore build the mass social movement that we need. I think we've been set back a bit by loss of the election, of course, but also by COVID, the ability to... But actually, the developments of various range of social movements on a whole range of issues now, whether it's from the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's movement, you've seen what's happening with mobilizations around Gaza at the moment as well. It just demonstrates to us the potential that there is to build a social movement around these issues themselves, and the confidence that people have, but also the ability that people have to cut through the hegemonic dominance that there is at the moment. So I think part of today, I'm hoping, will be the consideration of the next steps about how we build a social movement in this country that will be determined, to be frank, in our objectives and often in our methodology as well, by the social movements building in the global south. And in that way, I think we can make a significant contribution to the next stage. And that's what I commit myself to now. I commit myself to do everything I possibly can to build that social movement, because we have a weight of responsibility on our shoulders, because by our very existence in this capitalist, imperialist country that we have. And I actually do think, and that's why I want to thank the War on Want for organising this today, I actually do think this is a potential point of inflection where that social movement can be built. Solidarity.
Amazing. That was amazing. Thanks a lot, John. So now we have Jayati, as was mentioned. She's going to be joining us on Zoom all the way from India. Jayati.
Thank you. Wow, this has been such an amazingly rich discussion. I think I really want to, I don't have a hat to take off, but I really, really want to express my deep appreciation of everything that's been said so far. I'm actually coming to you from Bangalore, Bengaluru, where there is a big convention organized by the government of Karnataka, which it's a Congress government, recently won the elections. And it's a national convention. There are lots of people. In fact, there are even some people from across the world attending in solidarity. And it's talking about the Indian Constitution. I have to say, you know, John, when you were talking, I was thinking so many of the ideals that you mentioned are already written down in the Indian Constitution. They're explicitly there as fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. And yet we know what the trajectory has been since then. Similarly, they're there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually, in terms of, you know, it's a socialist manifesto in some way. I think we've had a fabulous discussion about, you know, the nature of the inequalities, the types of injustice but being perpetuated nationally and internationally, the mechanisms through which this is done. So I'm not going to belabor all of those points any further. I think it's now, all of you get it, right? You all know the nature of the problem and the beast. So I'm going to, in a sense, follow on from John, maybe add a few footnotes in terms of what this approach, what do we do about it? And where are the allies for what we do internationally? I'm going to think about some of the changes that have been mentioned by Bhumika, by Gyekye, by I forgot your name, I'm sorry, but you know, not Jason, but yes, and by John, in terms of where are the places, if we want to actually create an inflection point, where are the places internationally where we can try and intervene? A coalition of social movements from North and South, coalition of some state actors as well, to actually make a change. And so here are a few that I think are important. Bhumika mentioned, you know, the climate debt, the injustice of that, the need for reparations, and I completely agree. But I don't think we can kid ourselves that it's going to happen anytime soon, right? We know that this is an unjust system and that, you know, any minimal ethics would require some reparations. But we also know that these are not governments that are ethical. And we also know that global capitalism and the states that support them have actually no notion of morality. I mean, I can see many of you wearing Palestinian scarves. We don't have to belabor that point anymore in terms of the absence of morality. How do we then confront someone or an opposition, an enemy that has no intention of playing by rules because it will keep changing the rules as it goes on in its own advantage, or that will just create new rules in order to keep perpetuating a certain system? And I think what's happening globally is quite interesting right now because it is giving us fresh opportunities. I think Gyekye kind of also hinted at this. It's a period of really global churning, okay? And a lot of it is because of the actions of the US and the UK and Europe and so on in several different ways. First of all, the complete and obscene nationalism displayed during the COVID-19 pandemic, when not only were vaccines ordered, etc., but the technology was also prevented from being disseminated actively. And in the WTO, it was absolutely blatant. Every time the vote was, when there was a vote about whether you should have a lifting of all of the constraints on critical technologies needed for dealing with the pandemic during the period of the pandemic, that was systematically opposed by US, Europe, Japan, Australia. I mean, it was a complete north-south divide on that one. You then have the spectacle of the COVID-19 pandemic playing out in terms of massive increases in fiscal and monetary policy responses in the advanced countries and very little in the developing world. So on average, the advanced economies increased their government debt to GDP ratio from about 108% to 127% on average, okay? Some countries, of course, you know, Japan close to now beyond 300% of GDP, but all of them did huge fiscal expansion, suddenly throwing away that fiscal rule book that said you cannot increase your fiscal deficit. They all did that. The middle income countries and the low income countries didn't dare do it. Low-income countries, because they're already burdened by huge debt, as Bhumika has mentioned. Middle-income countries, because they were terrified about capital flight. So middle-income countries increased their government debt to GDP ratio from 55% to 58%. That's it, okay? Low-income countries, they don't increase. They go from 45 to 46%. They have no increase in spending. That increase in the deficit, in the debt to GDP ratio is entirely because their revenues collapsed during the pandemic, not because they spent more, which meant that they did not give social protection. They did not provide compensation to their people. They didn't do the minimum macroeconomic response that you would require to help economies recover after the pandemic either. That was the kind of inequality that has been created by that global system of financial integration, whereby you have this clear hierarchy of countries where some economies can get away with murder and the rest of the world cannot. And in fact, you're still punished anyway, because the other terrible thing that happens in that period is that the bond markets, how do they respond to this difference in fiscal behavior across these countries? You know how they're always going on about fiscal discipline, yeah, and austerity, etc. So they should have been happy. The middle-income countries and the low-income countries didn't spend much. They should be rewarded by the capital markets for this. What do we find? We find that the spread on sovereign debt of the advanced economies as a group doesn't go up at all. It's an absolutely flat line. It's less than 1 basis point. In other words, less than 0.1 percentage point of GDP above the US Fed rate, okay? So no change, despite all this so-called fiscal irresponsibility. What happens to the low and middle income countries? The spread on government debt starts rising during the pandemic, increases massively till about mid-2021, comes down a little bit. When the Ukraine war happens, it zooms up yet again. And you got low-income countries and debt-distressed countries, their spreads went up to 1,100 basis points, 11% above the US Fed rate is the increase in their borrowing costs, even when they have been very good, within inverted commas, in terms of behaving themselves and not creating larger deficits. So it is a deeply unjust, unequal global system, okay? That is another thing that has, shall we say, broken the faith of many developing countries in relying on a system like this. And then, of course, the Ukraine war itself, not only did it enable massive profiteering and financial speculation that led to big increases in food and fuel prices, but then when the prices went down again, they didn't go down for the low and middle income countries. Because meanwhile, our currencies are depreciated. So we are still facing food prices as high as they were during the peak of that spike, supposedly due to the Ukraine war, but actually, due to the profiteering and speculation. So you're left with all these consequences of policies in the advanced economies and a global system that will punish you for being at the bottom of this without any recourse. Now, why do I, in this situation, say that we're at an inflection point? Because, that Ukraine war also had other interesting consequences. All the processes that I've mentioned have really reduced the legitimacy of certainly G7. I think anywhere I go in any developing country in the last 2 years, that there is zero legitimacy, no matter what they may say, officially, of the G7 countries, or any hope of any expectation of any kind of fair deal from these countries. There is increasingly the recognition that you have to be looking for alternative trajectories, possibilities, and alternative arrangements. And then, of course, the Ukraine war and the sanctions that were imposed have completely justified that position. Because, you undergo sanctions that are illegitimate according to the international law that you propound. That is to say, you freeze a country's assets because you decide you don't like their policies, and then you say you're going to take over those assets and use them for purposes that you will decide, which is against all of their notions of, property and the protection of property, and international law doesn't allow you to take over assets without compensation, and et cetera, et cetera. It also means that other countries and their central bankers sit up and say, oh, wait a minute. It means that if they decide they don't like you, they can actually freeze you out. And not only that, they can deny you what is rightfully yours. They've done this for Cuba, of course, but they've done it for Venezuela, they've done it for Iran, now they've done it for Russia. And that means something. That means, okay, if they can do it to all of these countries, that means we have to have less and less reliance on reserves that are denominated in dollar and euro and in assets that are placed there. Now, I'm not saying that it's been a wholesale shift, of course not, because the power structures are still what they are. But there is definitely a change in direction. We are seeing more and more central banks investing in each other's assets, investing in RMB, investing in gold. And we are seeing more and more currency arrangements. The China exchange rate swap is now more important for more countries in the developing world than US Fed swaps. The US Fed swaps are only for their own allies. China is providing swaps, not talked about enough, but it's out there and it's happening a lot. China is providing debt relief. You won't believe that if you read the Western press, right? They're all going on about how it's all because of China that there's this major crisis. That's not true. It's mostly private debt, as Bhumika mentioned. But China is the one that is actually extending debt repayments over prolonged periods for many of these countries. They just refuse to join the Paris Club. Similarly, there are more trading arrangements now occurring in not quite barter, but certainly in different kinds of bilateral currencies. There's real talk of a BRICS sort of nominal, they're not going to call it a currency, but a BRICS unit of exchange for transaction, which will now encompass many more countries because all these oil exporters have joined it. So there are new things going on. And of course, all of these are going on at a time when, let's face it, for all practical purposes, the WTO is dead. Why? Because the US killed it, okay? They did not allow the dispute settlement mechanism, which is what really gives, all of these different agreements their teeth. They did not allow the dispute settlement to function. Trump refused to replace any of the people on the panel, and that meant that you were down to one. And I think even that one is now, the term is almost over, so that's it. Biden continued that. So the US has actually killed the WTO. Which, let me tell you, it's a good thing. We should not be saying bad news and so on. It's a good thing. It's what has enabled India to carry on with and potentially consider additional food subsidies to feed an extremely hungry population, when otherwise we would be coming up against the peace clause and US attacks on our food subsidy. It has enabled a number of countries to do industrial policy because the US has thrown all of those rules to the winds. All of the rules that earlier prevented industrial policy. They said, no, now we want to do it again. So they are doing it. European Union is doing it. So now it's an open season for other countries. Now, it doesn't mean that our governments will therefore do them and take progressive positions, but it does mean that political forces, progressive forces, social movements within our countries are able to demand these without facing a massive global backlash. And that's huge. I would argue that what we have to do now is to take cognizance of this changed global reality, where compared to 10 years ago, anything goes, and refuse to do many things that we otherwise felt we had to do. Developing countries all feel they have to repay their debt in entirety, even when, you heard Bhumika's numbers, even when it's many, many multiples of their other social spending. They don't have to. We can actually think of coalitions of debtor countries getting together and saying, no, we do not think this debt repayment is justified and we're not doing it. You want to negotiate? Come and negotiate with us as a group. It does mean you have to get together. It does mean you have to create coalitions, but you can do it. It's possible. The other low-hanging fruit, I really believe, is international taxation. And this is another example of coalitions working in the international space. The International Taxation Agreement was taken over by the OECD, which represents not just rich countries, but the big business of rich countries, the capitalists of rich countries. And so the outcome that we got, it's no surprise, the compromise deal was really depressing. A relatively low minimum tax rate, which 15%, which is well below the median rate for most developing countries. Most developing countries, our corporate tax rate is 25 to 30%. This 15% really, there's a real danger that will become the norm, okay? And the other part of the OECD proposition, the idea that you can tax global companies as one company and take your share of their global profits for your national taxation. That has gone up in smoke because the US has refused to sign it. There's no way it's going to be signed before November. So anyway, all of that means that the group of Africa, which had been fighting for many years to bring these discussions to the UN, to have a negotiation on global tax and a global convention at the UN, and had simply been stymied all these years, has managed it. They have brought, yesterday the negotiations started at the UN, and the terms of the negotiations have been agreed. There's a group of 20, the Vice Minister of Commerce from Egypt is going to be the chair, and developing countries now have a voice. This is huge. This is a real potential for doing agreements on sharing of banking and other information, creating global asset registries to actually be able to tax the extremely rich who are stashing their money all over the globe. On proper corporate taxation, we can actually get to rules like these. There's a whole range of areas in which the interests of developing countries in terms of raising their own resources, not relying on debt, not relying on little dribbles of aid from the rich world, will all matter. And so this is another huge area of potential. You know, it's always a mystery to me that this is presented as rich versus poor countries, because it's not about that. Taxation in particular, if you're taxing the wealthy or you're taxing multinational corporations, it's about the rich versus everybody else. So people in England need to be much more educated about the issues here and be pressing their government to actually take a better position. At the moment, guess who is opposing all of this in the UN tax negotiations? No surprises. The same lot who were preventing the TRIPS waiver in the WTO. Not representing the interests of their people, because the TRIPS waiver was in the interests of all people in all countries, but representing the interests of their corporations. It's now possible to think of international agreements that will actually be a little bit more progressive. I'm not saying hugely progressive, thin end of the wedge, but you can actually do that thin end of the wedge. There's a slightly different moment in history. And this is the time when all of us social movements, global south, north, east, west, we should be aligning to push for this in our own countries, forcing our negotiators to take particular positions on this. Finally, I just want to emphasize one other area of the international architecture, if you like, which John alluded to, and that is the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement, which is embodied in a huge range of agreements. There are more than 300 what they call free trade agreements. They're not really free trade agreements. They are, they're called different things now, economic partnership agreements and so on. But they are these agreements between groups of countries which are typically worse than the WTO in terms of the kinds of protection they give to companies and privileging corporate interests over people. But all of them rely on investor-state dispute settlement. There are more than 3,000 bilateral tax treaties. There are more than 2,000 bilateral investment treaties. Now, all of these have really rigorous and pretty terrible conditions that favor companies. And all of them rely on settlements done in these tribunals, which are known to favor companies because they're typically made of tax lawyers who used to work in those companies. So we really have to get rid of that. We have to demand the elimination of ISDS. And I think it can be done. Biden promised this just before he became president. He seems to have forgotten about it since then. But clearly, it was enough of a demand for him to think he should promise it. We can make that demand in our countries, that ISDS is a terrible system that only benefits large companies that are anyway taking everyone else in the economy for a ride. And we have to demand that those are simply removed, made illegal, or reneged on. You basically abandon them. A country can choose to say, I'm withdrawing from this agreement, and I'm withdrawing from this tribunal, and so on and so forth. These are small things. These are not revolutionary things. But I do believe that we have to begin with these things, to look for the cracks, to look for the weak links that we can break, because we are up against a big enemy, no doubt about it. We don't have time. But on the other hand, if we go for a very absolutist transformation, we're not likely to get that. So let's begin by looking at these potential, the thin end of the wedge. Let's go in there and get those, because we can get coalitions going on those. And we can actually get changes that will then embolden a whole lot of other progressive movements to demand even more progressive changes. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Amazing. Thanks again, Jayati. And so just on those last 2 points, so we do have a running campaign action on the UN Tax Convention. If you visit our stall, you can pick up one of the leaflets and learn more about that. And then on ISDS, this week, as some of you will have known, we were in the other session, we've been campaigning on the Energy Charter Treaty, which is the most used investment treaty when it comes to ISDS in the world. This week, the UK finally decided to withdraw from the ECT after years of campaigning. So we have only about 5 minutes for questions. I'll take one round of 3, right at the front and here.
I'm sorry, also, I will have to leave soon because I have to go back to this convention, but
Thank you.
It was great to listen to all of you. It was terrific. Thank you. Good to see all my friends here as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello? Oh, it's working. Okay, just to say, I'm in awe of being surrounded by so many incredibly smart people here, and my head is blown by the arguments I've been hearing today. It's very inspiring, as John says. I've got a quick question for, and I'm really sorry, I'm going to get a Not Jason t-shirt, I think, because with all these brains here, I do think we actually do really need to concern ourselves about the degrowth label. It's not an easy thing to sell. We want growth. We want growth in social security, life expectancy, biodiversity, democracy, education, justice. And it may be a useful term for sort of fighting against the ridiculous dependence on GDP growth figures. I agree it's a useful term, but we need something better than that to say this is what we're fighting for. Maybe it's global well-being. I don't know what the word is. You're the smart people, but that's, I think it's important we do have that banner to sort of rally around. But anyway, thanks ever so much for everyone involved here, really. War on one, asset and so on.
Yeah. Can I abuse my position to just come in very quickly on that before I leave?
Of course.
Yeah. I have to say, I really want to agree with that point. I think that is so important. And I'm sorry, Jason and my very good friend Jason and Not Jason, degrowth is the wrong way of selling this. And I'll tell you why. There are 2 reasons. Number one, I think GDP is a terrible indicator. It is really a terrible indicator even for defining material expansion, because we know it includes a lot of crap and it leaves out a lot of essential things like the care economy and so on. So if we don't believe in that indicator, why do we care whether it goes up or down? Why do we have to insist that it must come down? So I really do want to stress, let's talk about the well-being economy. Let's say we want an economy that works for people, that provides health for all, nutrition for all, social justice, a decent life, proper working conditions, a sustainable environment. Let's say we want all of those things, and we talk about the economy that delivers those things, which gives us the same policy prescriptions you've been talking about, and which I also completely believe in. The minute you get into degrowth, then we're constantly arguing about whether it should be, GDP should go up or down, which is a red herring. It's the wrong debate. So I would beseech my dear friend Jason and you and everybody else, let's get over this one. GDP sucks. It's awful. It's a useless indicator. Why are we giving it that importance? Let us talk about the well-being economy.
Sure. For my sins, I work in financial markets. Right? And I think there's a lot of the things that have been said here have been very pertinent, but I think there's 2 things that were said that were, I think, give you most value for money in terms of helping the global south. First one would be essentially for economies to form for want of a better term, a common market, and therefore a single currency, so that those countries can trade their goods with a bit more stability, right? The other one was essentially the Global South has much of the world's natural resources, but they do very little in adding value to them, right? So having some curbs, limits, however you want to call it, right, and essentially exporting finished goods as opposed to raw materials, therefore allowing those countries to develop their industries, develop their economies, and be able to trade in a position of power, shall we say.
So we have one more question at the front.
Are you going to take one more after that?
And then we'll take one more, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Okay, I have a question for, and I remember your name, Charles. Yeah, I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about concrete actions that actually lead to more people contesting state power and building these social movements. Like, how do you actually, what is the pipeline to do that? And then also, how do you envision that pipeline bringing change, like actually making that happen? Because from what I've seen with a lot of stuff that's going on in Gaza, a lot of people are more aware, they have more knowledge, but when it comes to demanding a ceasefire, there's not like the actual change happening. So when you're asking for change that is misaligned with the like profits or profitability of the people in power, how do you ensure that happens?
And then we got one on the
Yes,
left.
thank you so much. Just wanted to say that based on the atmospheric colonization, the global north has an imperative to degrowth. And degrowth is not about an indicator, it's about the growing concentration of wealth, the extraction that is doing in the global south, and also degrowing the harmful sectors. And there are so many. So just really wanted to say that, going back to what Bhumika and Gyekye said, it is about the material conditions of people, and that is what we need to degrow. The global north is the core of the empire, and we need to smash it, and that is your responsibility here.
I don't know which one of you want to tackle these first. Maybe Charles.
First of all, that was really eloquently put, so I don't need to answer that. Well done. And thank you for the question about political organization. I think this is key. We've talked a lot about the need for powerful social movements that can hold these institutions for account. But the question is, how are these movements getting organized, right? What are the actual structures that are in place so that disciplined political work can take place, right? And right now, if we're talking about here in the UK, we have two parties that claim to be for business. And frankly, like, I don't believe that the Labour Party can be both for workers and for business. At some point, you have to choose, right? So we need new structures that can enable this political struggle. And frankly, here in the UK, I know you've had a lot of experiments with a lot of political parties, but you need some kind of new political party that can channel this work. This needs to happen, okay? And I really liked, John, that you brought up Antonio Gramsci, because his work is so important, and we often remember him as a political theorist, and he was brilliant. But he also wrote The Modern Prince. The Modern Prince is an ode to the Revolutionary Party. All right, so let's get serious about disciplined revolutionary work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Charles, Comrade Charles. Thanks too for the, ridiculously short time for the discussion, and I'd hoped that we could develop some more points there. But I think a number of things have to be probably re-emphasizing. I sought to stress the capabilities that we have in terms of the transformation of our own power, if we understand the nodal points and the links that cut across wherever you are in the world, understand our capacity as people who produce the wealth from which it is stolen, and understand our capacity as political agents of change. That's what I sought to stress. And in doing so, I think I can understand the agenda of degrowth. Of course, it's been explained very well. But the fact is that people are so wedded to growth, and that in the same way that they can conceive of the end of many things rather than the end of capitalism, there's also the sense in which they can conceive of anything but the end of growth. So for example, one of the linkages that exists, just to use a concrete example, in addition to the kind of monopoly over African ecologies and natural wealth that the Rio Tintos of this world represent, last week in Kenya, BlackRock, the world's biggest asset management company, controlling assets over $9 to $10 trillion, bought Africa's biggest wind farm in Kenya, around Lake Turkana. BlackRock is not simply a big asset management company. It controls pensions, including yours. It controls the investments of local authorities, the length and breadth of the local authorities who are going bankrupt, allegedly, in Britain, and so on and so forth. So the democratization that we're talking about requires us to have a sense of how we can reorganize economies, economic relations, based on the power that we have. And that power is not simply about our vulnerability to the BlackRocks of this world, or the fact that we must bow down and make a god out of, a fetish out of growth. So I think that the kind of cross-fertilization that requires us to come to the point where we build that quality, that threshold of collective social agency that can transform things is important. Otherwise, we end up with other things that even rulers of the global south are doing. We talk about alternative trade arrangements. In Africa today, many African governments will tout the fact that there is what they call the world's biggest free trade area, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. The model of that is precisely the growth that we are concerned with. The model of that is precisely the attraction of foreign capital on the best terms possible and on terms of de-risking private finance, the kinds of things that Bhumika excoriated, to construct the kind of new green capitalism that African countries, economies, rulers, elites seek to benefit from. So it's in that vein that we ought to see that people are not simply victims, even if they're in the most remote communities, or it's in that vein that we ought to see that if you're on the streets of London or wherever else you are in Britain, you are not simply a passive person who cannot find a way to transform. And I think that's why the question of agency, in addition to the policy recommendations, is absolutely central. But let me end on one point. I agree completely with Charles. What we require, even if it is not absolutist to talk about revolution at this point in time, because faced with that, short of that, if you look at China's power, that too could be another geopolitical war. We need an alternative, root and branch, and whatever steps that we take in terms of reform, without a revolutionary vision, we're not going very far. So I support James. Let's have that revolution, and let's have that in our thinking and the way we organize starting now. Thank you.
Thank you. We have to wrap it up now. Just to say, because we've been running over.